I left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on 1st of May and got into Vienna early the next morning. Well, we were supposed to be there by 6:46, but the train ran late, about an hour. Budapest looked pretty cool from what I could see out the window. Didn't want to stray too far from the station, since we were already behind schedule. There was this sense, though, like I was stepping into a whole different vibe, you know? The bridges over the Danube were impressive, wide and deep, almost like crossing into some ancient, mysterious world. We left pretty much on time after that and reached Klausenberg by nightfall. I stayed at the Hotel Royale, had this chicken dish covered in red pepper, called it paprika Händel. Tasty, but left me thirsty. Note to self, get the recipe for Mina. The waiter said it was a local thing, and I could probably find it all over the Carpathians. My German's coming in handy here. I'd be pretty lost without it. Before leaving London, I spent some time at the British Museum, looking up maps and books on Transylvania. Figured it'd help when dealing with this Count Dracula character. Turns out his place is way out east, near the borders of Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, deep in the Carpathian Mountains. The region's wild. Hardly any maps worth anything. Couldn't find the exact location of Castle Dracula, but Bistritz, where I'm headed, is a known spot. Gonna jot down some notes to remind me when I fill Mina in on all this later. Transylvania's got a pretty diverse crowd, man. You got the Saxons down south, mixed with the Wallachs, who say they're descendants of the Dacians. Then there's the Magyars out west, and the Sikelis up north and east. I'm heading into Sikeli territory, and they claim to be descendants of Attila the Hun. Might be true. When the Magyars rolled in during the 11th century, they found the Huns already settled in. I read somewhere that the Carpathians are like the center of every superstition out there, like a vortex for weirdness. If that's true, this trip could get real interesting. Definitely gotta ask the Count about it. Last night was rough. The bed was comfortable enough, but I couldn't sleep. Kept having these strange dreams, and there was this dog howling outside my window all night. Might have been that or the paprika from dinner, 'cause I drank all the water in the room and was still thirsty. Eventually, I fell asleep, only to get woken up by someone knocking on my door. Guess I was out pretty cold by then. For breakfast, more paprika, obviously, and this maize porridge they call mamaliga, plus eggplant stuffed with meat. They call it implatata. It was solid. Definitely need to get the recipe for Mina. I had to rush through it though, 'cause the train was supposed to leave just before 8. But, surprise, I ended up sitting in the carriage for over an hour before we even started moving. Seems like the further east I go, the less punctual things get. Makes me wonder how they handle things in China. We spent the whole day kind of drifting through this beautiful countryside. It was like one of those old paintings in a missal or something. Little towns and castles perched up on steep hills, rivers winding along with these wide, rocky banks. You could tell they got some serious floods around here from time to time. Takes a strong current to clear out the sides of a river like that. Every station we stopped at was packed with people, dressed in all sorts of ways. Some of them looked just like the peasants back home, or like the folks I saw in France and Germany. Short jackets, round hats, handmade trousers, the whole deal. But others? Way more colorful. The women looked kind of pretty from a distance, though up close, let's just say the waistlines weren't really doing them any favors. They all wore these puffy white sleeves with big belts covered in strips of cloth fluttering around like ballet dresses, but with petticoats underneath. Then there were the Slovaks. Now those guys were something else. Big cowboy hats, baggy white trousers, and shirts made of rough linen. The belts were huge, like nearly a foot wide, covered in brass studs, and they tucked their pants into these high boots. With their long black hair and those heavy mustaches, they looked like they just stepped off the set of some old-school brigand flick, straight-up Oriental bandits. Not exactly welcoming, but from what I hear, they're harmless enough, just not the type to stand up for themselves too much. By the time we rolled into Bistritz, it was that kind of eerie twilight, just on the edge of darkness. The place has seen some things, man. It's right near the frontier with the Borgo Pass leading straight into Bukovina, so it's had a pretty rough history. You can still see the scars. 50 years ago, there were these huge fires, 5 of them, that really tore through the town. And way back in the early 1600s, it went through a gnarly siege that lasted 3 weeks. They lost 13,000 people to the whole mess. War, famine, disease, you name it. Dracula had told me to head to the Golden Krone Hotel, and when I got there, I was stoked to see how old school it was. Exactly the kind of vibe I was hoping for to soak in the local culture. It felt like they were waiting for me too. As I got closer, this older lady, totally cheerful, in the usual peasant getup, met me at the door. She had on a white undergarment with this colorful apron thing that was kind of tight, maybe a little too tight for modesty, but hey, that's just how they do it here. She gave me a smile and asked, "The her Englishman?" "Yep," I said, "Jonathan Harker." She nodded and passed some message to this old guy in white shirt sleeves who was hanging around. He ducked inside, but came right back out with a letter. It was from Dracula himself. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula." Seems like this trip's about to get even more interesting. Turns out my landlord had received a letter from the Count, arranging for me to be picked up in a car. But when I tried to ask him for more details, he suddenly clammed up, pretending he didn't understand my German. Now, that's got to be a load of nonsense, because he'd been getting by just fine with my German up until now, answering everything like he was fluent or something. He and his wife, the old lady who first greeted me, started giving each other these nervous, almost scared looks. He mumbled something about how the money came in a letter, and that's all he knew. I pressed him a bit, asking if he knew Count Dracula or anything about the castle, and man, that freaked them both out. They crossed themselves real quick and just refused to say another word. The timing was tight, and I couldn't exactly go around asking more folks about it. The whole situation felt off, but, business is business, right? Just before I was about to leave, the old lady, in full-on panic mode, came rushing into my room. "Must you go?" "Oh, young her, must you go?" she asked, practically shaking. She got so worked up she started mixing German with some other language I couldn't make heads or tails of. I tried to keep up by asking a bunch of questions, and she finally got across her point. When I told her I had to leave for some important business, she hit me with, "Do you know what day it is?" I told her, yeah, it was the 4th of May, but that didn't seem to satisfy her. "Oh, yes. I know that. But do you know what day it is?" She pressed again. I was clueless, so she laid it out for me. "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" The poor lady was so freaked out, I tried to calm her down, but it didn't work. She actually got down on her knees, begging me not to go, or at least to wait a day or two. It was kind of ridiculous, but I'll admit, it didn't exactly leave me feeling chill. Still, I had things to do, and I wasn't about to let superstition get in the way. I helped her up and said as seriously as I could that I appreciated the warning, but I had to get going. She finally stood up, drying her eyes, and pulled a crucifix from around her neck. She offered it to me, and I didn't know what to do. As an Englishman, I've always been taught to see that stuff as a bit idolatrous, but turning her down felt wrong, especially with how worked up she was. She must have seen the hesitation on my face because she just looped the rosary around my neck herself, saying, "For your mother's sake." And then she left the room. I'm writing this while waiting for the car, which is running late, of course. The crucifix is still hanging around my neck, and man, whether it's the old lady's fear, the local ghost stories, or this thing itself, I'm not exactly feeling as relaxed as I'd like. If this journal makes it to Mina before I do, well, let it serve as my goodbye. Here comes the car. It is a nice red Mustang. Looks like there's a couple of other dudes tagging along for the ride along with the driver. Hope they're not serial killers or anything. So, the gray of the morning's gone, and the sun's doing its thing, hanging way up over the horizon, all jagged and distant. Can't tell if it's the trees or the hills making it look that way. Everything's blending together out there, too far off to tell. I ain't feeling sleepy, and since no one's gonna wake me till I wake myself, I figure I might as well jot some stuff down till sleep decides to show up. Got a few odd things rattling around in my head. And, hey, before anyone thinks I overdid it on dinner back in Bistritz, let me break down exactly what I ate. They called it robber steak. Sounds wild, right? But it's just chunks of bacon, onion, and beef, all spiced up with red pepper and grilled on sticks. Real simple, like some street food in London. Honestly, it wasn't half bad. The wine, though, golden meaty ash, they called it, had this weird little bite to it, like a sting on the tongue, but I kind of liked it. Only had a couple glasses of the stuff, didn't go overboard. Anyway, when I got into the car, I noticed the driver wasn't in his seat yet. Instead, he was off chatting with the landlady, and it was pretty clear they were talking about me. Every now and then, they'd both glance over, and some folks hanging out on the bench nearby, guess it's called the word bearer in their language, started listening in. Most of them gave me these pitying looks. Yeah, comforting. They kept repeating these strange words, so I quietly grabbed my polyglot dictionary from my bag and started looking them up. Gotta say, what I found wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear. Words like Ordog, that's Satan, Pokol, Hell, Stragoica, which and then Vrolok and Volkoslak. Both of those mean the same thing, one in Slovak and the other in Serbian. Werewolf or vampire. I gotta ask the Count about these superstitions. Yeah, I've definitely landed somewhere strange. When we finally started, the crowd around the inn door had grown to a decent size, and every single one of them made the sign of the cross, throwing 2 fingers my way. Weird, right? I had to work at it, but eventually I got one of the other passengers to clue me in on what that was all about. Dude didn't want to say anything at first, but once he figured out I was English, he told me it was a charm, something to ward off the evil eye. Now, that's not exactly the vibe you want when you're off to meet some guy you've never even seen in a place you've never been to. But honestly, everyone seemed so genuinely kind and full of sympathy, like they knew something I didn't. I couldn't help but feel touched by it all. I'll never shake the memory of that last look back at the inn yard. These colorful, almost storybook characters, all crossing themselves beneath this big archway, surrounded by bright oleander and orange trees and big green tubs right in the middle of the yard. Then our driver, decked out in these massive purple flares, revved up the engine and off we went. At first, I was caught up in the spooky mood from all those superstitions, but the scenery was so stunning that I forgot about it pretty quick. Though if I'd actually understood the language, or rather languages being spoken around me, I might have stayed more on edge. In front of us stretched this totally chill green landscape, packed with forests and groovy hills. It was spring, so the place was bursting with fruit blossoms, apple, plum, pear, cherry. As we cruised by, I noticed petals scattered on the grass beneath the trees, looking like nature's confetti. The road meandered through the hills, sometimes vanishing around a bend or getting lost in the edges of pine forests, which looked like they were creeping down the hillsides like slow-moving waves. As the sun dipped behind us, evening shadows began to wrap around the scene. The mountaintop, catching the last of the light, glowed with a soft pink hue. We cruised past a mix of Czechs and Slovaks in their traditional outfits, and it was hard not to notice how goiters seemed to be everywhere. Along the road, there were crosses set up at intervals, and each time we passed one, my fellow passengers crossed themselves. Every now and then, a peasant was kneeling before a shrine, deep in prayer and totally zoned out from the world. The landscape had its own quirks. Herricks stuck up in trees, and striking weeping birch trees with their silver-white trunks shimmering through delicate green leaves. We passed by modern agricultural vehicles, like pickup trucks and tractors, as well as colorful trucks loaded with goods and heading back from market. The Czechs wore white sheepskins, while the Slovaks sported colorful ones and carried long staves with axes strapped to the end. As evening fell, the temperature dropped, and darkness started blending the shadows of oak, beech, and pine trees into one giant, dark mist. The valleys between the hills were still blanketed in snow, making the fir trees stand out sharply against the white. Sometimes the road cut through dense pine woods, and in the fading light, the scene took on an eerie, solemn vibe, amplifying the ghostly clouds and the darkening landscape. The hills were so steep that, despite the driver's brisk pace, the car could only crawl up slowly. I thought about getting out and walking like we do back home, but the driver wasn't having any of it. "No, no," he said. "You mustn't walk here, the dogs are too fierce." He tried to joke about it, clearly looking for a laugh from the others, and you might end up with more of that kind of company than you'd want before you crash. The only break he allowed was a quick stop to check and adjust the car's headlights. When it got dark, the passengers started buzzing with excitement, urging the driver to step on it. He was revving the engine like he was in a race, and with each burst of acceleration, the car felt like it was bouncing around, like something out of a wild, off-the-wall flick. I had to brace myself just to stay in place. The road started to smooth out, and we picked up speed. It felt like we were charging straight into the Borgo Pass, with those towering mountains closing in on us like they were gearing up to give us a rough time. One by one, the passengers handed me weird little gifts with a lot of serious face, like they were saying some heavy prayers. Each gift came with a mix of good vibes and worried glances, and they kept making that sign of the cross and doing some weird hand movements. It was just like what I saw outside the hotel in Bistritz. Everyone seemed to be doing a ritual to ward off bad luck. As we barreled through, the driver was all tense, leaning forward while the passengers craned their necks, peering into the dark through the windows like they were waiting for a big reveal. I kept asking what was up, but no one was talking. The excitement kept building, and finally we saw the pass opening up ahead. The clouds were rolling in like a bad omen, and the air felt thick with thunder. I was keeping an eye out for the ride that was supposed to take me to the Count, but all I saw was darkness and the occasional flicker of our own lighters. The road was pale in the headlights, but there was no sign of any other vehicle. The passengers let out a collective sigh of relief, which didn't help my own growing disappointment. Just as I was trying to figure out my next move, the driver glanced at his watch and mumbled something to the others, though it was too low for me to catch. I thought I heard him say something about being an hour less than the time. Then he turned to me and said in a German accent that was even harder to follow than mine, "The Her is not expected after all. He'll head to Bukovina and return tomorrow, or maybe the next day. Better the next day." Just as the car started to shake and shudder, a sleek black Chevrolet Camaro roared up behind us, cutting through the night like something out of a Gothic movie. The car was so shiny and black it almost absorbed the light. The driver of this new ride was a tall figure with a dark hat pulled low over his face, making him look like a shadowy presence straight out of a nightmare. All I could make out were his eyes, glowing red in the car's dashboard lights, like he'd been hitting the heavy stuff. He leaned in and said to our driver, "You're early tonight, man." Our driver stuttered. The English was in a hurry. The dude in the hat grinned, showing a set of teeth that could only be described as unnervingly white. "That's why you sent him off to Bukovina. You can't fool me, buddy. I know what's up, and I'm the best driver in town." As he spoke, he had this creepy, knowing smile, like he was in on some cosmic joke. One of my fellow passengers, clearly spooked, whispered to another, quoting Berger's "Lenore, den die, taten reiten schnell," for the dead travel fast. The strange driver caught the whispered line and flashed a grin that could give a ghoul nightmares. The passenger, clearly rattled, turned away, crossing himself and throwing out his fingers like he was warding off something wicked. "Hand over the hare's luggage," the driver said, and my bags were quickly tossed into the black car. I climbed out of the Mustang, and as I did, the driver extended a hand that felt like it could crush metal. His grip was solid and intimidating, making it clear this guy was no one to mess with. Without a word, he started the car, and we roared into the murky darkness of the pass. Glancing back, I saw the tail lights of the departing vehicle fading into the night as my old travel companions crossed themselves in a frantic, almost ritualistic manner. The driver gunned the engine, and the car sped off into the night toward Bukovina. As the lights of the previous vehicle disappeared into the abyss, a chill crept up my spine, making me question my decisions. The driver then draped a heavy cloak over my shoulders and tossed a rug across my knees. With a calm tone in flawless German, he said, "Welcome to the wild side, man. Let's roll. The night is chill. Mein Herr, and my master the Count bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of Slivovitz, the plum brandy of the country, underneath the seat if you should need it." The driver's laid-back tone, almost like he was just lounging around, had a strangely calming effect. I didn't take any of the brandy, but it was reassuring to know it was there. I felt a bit uneasy, a mix of discomfort and trepidation. Honestly, If there had been any other option, I might have taken it just to escape the creepy, unknown night journey ahead. The car sped along, making swift, sharp turns that made it feel like we were retracing our steps. I noticed we were essentially driving in circles, and though I wanted to ask the driver what was going on, I was too wary to make a fuss. It seemed like any objection would be pointless. Curiosity got the better of me, so I checked my watch. It was almost midnight. This gave me a jolt, as I'm sure the whole midnight superstition was messing with my head. I waited with a knot in my stomach. Suddenly, a howl pierced the night from somewhere distant, and soon it felt like the whole countryside was echoing with mournful wails. The car's engine roared as the driver fought to maintain control. The vehicle's tires screeched and skidded slightly as the driver struggled to keep us on the road, the howls growing louder and more intense. The powerful engine and the driver's focused demeanor helped us stay on track, even as the eerie sounds of the wolves seemed to close in around us. I was on edge, but the driver's calm and unwavering control of the vehicle kept us moving forward through the unsettling night. After a few minutes, the howling became a background noise as the driver, having slowed down briefly, took control again. We sped off once more, only to take a sharp turn down a narrow road that veered off to the right. As we drove, the trees started closing in, their branches arcing over us like we were cruising through a trippy, natural tunnel. Massive, shadowy rocks flanked us on both sides, giving off a vibe like we were inside some ancient beast lair. Even though we were sort of sheltered, the wind was still wailing and the branches were smacking together, like nature was having its own freak-out session. It got super cold and snow started drifting down, turning everything into a chill white blanket. The howling dogs were still out there, but their cries got fainter as we rolled along. The wolves, though, seemed to be tightening their circle, their growls echoing closer and closer. I was totally freaked out, and it felt like the car was feeding off my anxiety, jittering and swerving as I did. But the driver? Totally unflappable, like nothing could shake him. He kept glancing around through the dark, but I couldn't make out anything in the pitch-black night. Then, out of nowhere, I saw this tiny, flickering blue flame off to our left. The driver noticed it too. He slammed on the brakes, jumped out into the darkness, and disappeared. I was left there, feeling the wolves' howls closing in, wondering what the heck was going on. The driver came back, climbed into his seat without a word, and we took off again. I must have zonked out or something, because I kept dreaming the same freaky scene over and over. The driver kept going back to that blue flame, which barely lit up the place. He stacked a few stones in some weird pattern, and for a moment, it was like this wild optical illusion. When he stood between me and the flame, it still flickered like it was playing tricks on me. The blue flames vanished, and we pushed through the darkness with the wolves' howls wrapping around us like a creepy, nocturnal blanket. After a while, the driver vanished into the shadows again, and I was left alone in the car again, sitting ominously in the dark. The howling of the wolves grew louder, echoing all around us. Just then, the moon peeked through the clouds and cast a ghostly light over us. That's when I saw the wolves, an entire creepy pack, their white teeth and red tongues hanging out, their long limbs and shaggy fur looking like something from a bad dream. Then, as if the moonlight had flipped a switch, the wolves started howling again. I'm telling you, I was so freaked out. We were stuck in this ring of terror with no escape. I honked the car's horn repeatedly, hoping to scare off the wolves or at least get the driver's attention so he could return. The sound echoed through the night, but it seemed like the wolves were undeterred, their eerie howls growing louder. I wasn't sure how he managed it, but I heard his voice commanding the wolves. I looked up and saw him standing in the road, his arms sweeping through the air like he was swatting away invisible ghosts. The wolves backed off, retreating into the dark. But just as things seemed to settle, a heavy cloud rolled over the moon, and we were plunged back into darkness. When the moonlight finally peeked through the clouds again, the driver got back in the car, and the wolves had mysteriously vanished. The whole situation felt like some surreal trip, so out there and creepy that I was too spooked to say anything. Time dragged like an eternity as we cruised through nearly complete darkness, with clouds constantly rolling by and hiding the moon. We kept climbing up, occasionally dipping, but mostly it felt like an endless, groovy ascent. Then, out of nowhere, I realized we had stopped in the courtyard of this colossal, dilapidated castle. It loomed over us, dark and mysterious, with tall windows completely black and broken battlements slicing through the moonlit sky. It looked like something straight out of a bad dream or a heavy trip.